I call Aaron Siri to present his comparative analysis of the childhood and adolescent immunization schedule.
Good afternoon. I was asked to speak about the development of the U.S. childhood vaccine schedule, and I'd understood actually I'd be speaking about the schedule alongside Dr. Pauloff and Dr. Peter Hotez, who I understood were invited, but it appears I will be presenting about this on my own. Obviously, it's a massive topic. There's a lot to discuss when it comes to the U.S. vaccine schedule, and so my presentation will be focused at a very high level. I don't plan to get into any particular issue too deeply or get into any specific injuries or specific efficacy points per se. And I'll try to make just a few small suggestions along the way.
One of which is improvement in our audiovisual capabilities so that the slide advance works.
Well, I found this here on the tape. Okay, there we go. Or did somebody move that for me? Did that?
Where are you supposed to point it? You point it down with that.
If there's somebody, well, if there's somebody who could guide me on how to.
Do we have AV support for manually advancing slides based on Aaron Siri's requests? Looks, one moment, technical difficulties. Here's
Yeah.
AV.
You're saying next slide? Okay, great. Go back one slide, please. Thank you. Okay, and we'll start with a disclaimer. I'm the managing partner of Siri and Glimstead LLP. I'm an attorney. I manage a firm with over 100 professionals who handle civil rights, exemptions, immigration, employment, and injury claims related to vaccination. We do all of those things related to vaccination. For nearly a decade, I've regularly engaged with and sued federal and state health agencies regarding vaccination-related issues. I've also deposed and cross-examined vaccinologists. I also disclose that my firm currently is handling numerous lawsuits against HHS and its agencies and related government agencies, including 93 FOIA lawsuits against federal agencies, a large proportion of which relate to vaccination. We currently have a lawsuit against HHS, HRSA, and other government agencies and officials seeking to strike down the constitutionality of the PrEP Act, which provides immunity for COVID-19 vaccine injuries. We also have a lawsuit against the Air Force and the U.S. Army relating to COVID vaccine exemptions, which are close to wrapping up. We also have 492 claims that are currently pending against HHS with regards to vaccine injuries in the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And we represent 8 clients in the CICP, the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program. We also have other lawsuits against federal government, for example, regarding fluoride, though I don't think those are relevant to disclose, so I'm not going to go through all of those. And I will not be discussing any of the currently pending lawsuits in today's presentation. One more point before I get to the presentation. I should also point out that given Senator Cassidy's comment yesterday that I earn my living by suing vaccine manufacturers, I'd just like to point out that I do not earn my living suing vaccine manufacturers. That is because the vaccine companies have effective immunity for vaccine harms and claims because of the passage of the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. It is in fact, childhood vaccines are in fact the only product in America where you can never sue a company to claim that your child would not have been injured or killed had the product been made safer by the company that sold it and profited from it. And I'm also the author of a book called Vaccines, Amen, The Religion of Vaccines. Okay. With all of those disclosures aside, next slide, please. I begin with the growth of the U.S. childhood vaccine schedule. Next slide, please. Now, ACIP was formed in 1964, and while it made recommendations since its inception, the first schedule effectively for vaccines that it published was in 1983. On the slide on your screen, you can see on the left side, this is from the CDC website. It has a page titled Prior Immunization Schedules, and you can see the oldest one listed is from 1983. On the right side of your screen, you can see a copy of that schedule. Effectively, there were 3 routine vaccines on it, DTP, including TD, OPV, and MMR. On your screen, you can now see the current vaccine schedule. This is just the childhood schedule. There's also an adult schedule. There are other schedules, recommendations for during pregnancy, travel schedules. I'm just going to be talking about the childhood schedule today, as I was requested to do. On the screen on the left side lists all of the currently recommended vaccines, and on the right side are the intervals. To provide a visualization of the schedule between 1983 and today, on this slide, what you will see are all of the standalone routine vaccines given in 1983 versus today, and they're listed at the earliest recommended age for each one. The ones denoted in orange are given on or before the first birth date, and the ones in black are given thereafter. So you can see there's been a significant increase in just the routine vaccines between 1983 and today. This slide includes the routine as well as the shared clinical decision-making vaccines on the schedule, which would mean including COVID-19 and meningococcal B. And otherwise, it's the same as the last slide. And again, the orange are all the doses, the injections given, on or before the first birth date, and the black are thereafter. One final visualization. On this slide, you could see just the vaccines that are routinely recommended. So just the routine vaccines routinely recommended by ACIP and on the CDC schedule in 1983 versus the current schedule. In 83, there were 2 oral drops and 3 injections. Today, there are 3 oral drops and 25 injections given by the first birthday, including in utero. And on this slide, you can see the difference in vaccine uptake between 1983 and 2020. This chart reflects the uptake rate by 2 years of age. That's how the data was collected, effectively for 2 years of age for both of them, with the exception of Tdap, HPV, and meningococcal ACWY, MENG4. Those are for the uptake for 13 to 17-year-olds because they're given later. And obviously you could see quite a difference. In 1983, you had MMR's uptake, 1+ dose was 66%. For it is currently, at least as of 2020, which would mean a 2018 birth cohort, it is at 92%. For DTP, it's gone from 65%, 3+ doses, to currently 94%, 3+ doses. And the schedule currently has 5 doses of DTaP and 1 dose of Tdap, and then 3 doses of OPV, 57% in 1983, and currently it's at 93% for at least 3 doses of IPV, both polio vaccines. And for the remainder of them, they were effectively 0 in 1983, and they currently are between 60 to 90%, and over 90% today, or as of, 2020. Okay. Next topic is going to be the pre-licensure safety with regards to the U.S. childhood vaccine schedule. On this slide, we're going to take a look at each of the routine recommended standalone vaccines on the CDC's childhood schedule. And those are all denoted in blue. And then the ones in orange are all of the vaccines that were used as a control to license any of the current routine injected childhood vaccines, and any relied upon to license those down the chain. This chart reflects the critical importance of clinical trials in the decision-making of ACIP over the years. And that is because, as we go through this, you will see most recommendations for routine use by ACIP of a particular vaccine happened very shortly after its licensure. And hence the primary data often available for that specific vaccine would have been its clinical trial data. It hadn't been used yet. It had not yet been licensed and used routinely or otherwise in the American public. When you, as I just noted, the first column are every single current standalone routine recommended vaccine, again in green, and in orange, anyone ever used as a control to license those. In the second column, it was the year that the vaccine was licensed. In the third column, it has the year that the vaccine was recommended for routine use by this committee. And if there was an earlier recommendation that was less than routine, it's put in brackets. And then the fourth column, which is really what I want to focus on, the fourth column reflects, and we did it in days instead of years or months, because the number of days between the licensure and the recommendation by ACIP for routine use, or if something was less than routine before routine, how many days that was. What you'll see when you look at this chart is that often, for almost all of them, the time period between licensure and ACIP's recommendation was a month or two. I'll note the exceptions. The two standalone hepatitis B vaccines, Recomavax HB and Engerix B, did have a non-routine recommendation within about a year, half a year of their licensure, but the routine recommendation for each one came about 5 years later, and one was 2 years later. For IPOL, it was a significant amount of time, many years, as it slowly replaced OPV on the schedule. And then you have the two hepatitis A vaccines, Havrix and Vacta, which were each, did have within a year or two a non-routine recommendation for areas considered high risk of Hep A. But it was years before they actually made a routine recommendation for Hep A to be used universally. And of course, and in my experience, if I could interject my own personal view on this, when the government makes a decision to recommend something, to tell the public to do something, they're often very hesitant to admit they're wrong or go backwards. And hence, the data available when these decisions were made to add each one of these vaccines as a routine vaccine to the schedule is critically important. So having robust clinical trial data, really important. It's not only important for what the work of this committee, I actually would add it's also important for the work that I do, in that when a client calls our firm, for example, about a vaccine injury, and we have to oftentimes prove causation, even when we go to the vaccine injury compensation program, we start with clinical trial data. We need good clinical trial data. And so when we look at a clinical trial, there are four main things that we looked at to see the quality of the trial. Obviously, we want to have good quality clinical trials that rely upon the licensed routine vaccine. First is, what is the baseline of safety? And that's dependent on what the control is. If the control and what the control group receives has not already been shown to be safe, then you don't have a good baseline of safety. And so the control should be a placebo, which is defined by the FDA as an inert substance, or it should be another vaccine if for the same indication, if it was properly trialed prior to licensure. And of course, even if you have a proper control group, you still need to review safety for long enough during the trial, or efficacy as well. In a JAMA article, which was the authors were affiliated with the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics at the FDA and Duke Clinical Research Institute, they explain that, quote, to provide complete safety data across all critical periods of growth and development, that's what clinical trials should do, end quote, as compared to trials for adults, quote, data on drug efficacy and safety in children may require an additional 6 years, end quote. And that is because obviously when you give a product to a baby, or an infant in particular, you often won't know what neurological, immunological, or developmental issues that product can cause until you've tracked that child for at least a few years. And even if the trial has been properly controlled and has an appropriate safety duration, it still needs to be properly powered. If it doesn't have enough children in the trial, it's not going to catch safety issues. And depending on how efficacy is being determined, it won't determine if it's efficacious, whether it's using a correlate of protection or it's actually looking at reducing the burden of actual disease directly. And it should be randomized and blinded, obviously. On the next slide, we have some examples of drug trials relied upon to license 4 different drugs to avoid cherry picking as much as possible. I'm using on this slide the 4 most profitable drugs sold by Pfizer according to an article from 2019. And in those trials, you can see the safety was reviewed for years against a placebo-controlled trial prior to licensure. When it comes to childhood vaccine trials, here is what Dr. Stanley Plotkin, whose name is on the gavel at ACIP, and as well as Dr. Walter Ornstein, who I think are probably known to many of you, said very recently. They wrote that widespread vaccine hesitancy observed during the COVID-19 pandemic suggests that the public is no longer satisfied with the traditional safety goal of simply detecting and quantifying the associated risks after a vaccine has been authorized for use, and that post-authorization studies are needed to fully characterize the safety profile of a new vaccine, since pre-licensure clinical trials have limited sample sizes, follow-up durations, and population heterogeneity. And let's put some substance to those claims made by Dr. Plotkin and Dr. Ornstein. Let's begin with the controls used to license each clinical trial for every routine injected childhood vaccine. Again, controls are critical because if you don't have a baseline of safety in your clinical trial, your comparison may not be appropriate when it comes to safety. It might be for efficacy, but not for safety. And so for the 2 current standalone hepatitis B vaccines, Engerix B and Recombavax HB, what you'll see is that they were licensed for children based on an uncontrolled trial. So there was no control group in the clinical trial relied upon to license those for children. What they were comparing it against is unknown. For DTaP, there are 2 licensed standalone vaccines, Infanrix and Dapticel, both licensed based on trials where DTP was used as a control, but DTP was never licensed based on a placebo-controlled trial. The 3 HIV vaccines you can see on this chart again when you go down the chain, Actib, licensed against the Hep B vaccine, which itself was not licensed based on a placebo-controlled trial. Same thing for Hibarex, Actib, then Hep B, then no control, and Pedvax-Hib, which was licensed against where the control was a lyophilized Pedvax-Hib, but the control group in the trial relied upon for that vaccine was an injection that included lactose, aluminum adjuvant, and thimerosal all in the vial. Again, not a placebo, not inert. And then the 2 PCV vaccines, you can see the chain as well. They were both licensed based on trials where Prevnar 13 was used as a control. Prevnar 13 was licensed based on a trial which Prevnar 7 was used as a control. And Prevnar 7 was licensed based on a trial in which another investigational vaccine was used as a control. Prevnar 7 being the first licensed PCV vaccine, there was certainly no excuse to not use an inert control for that trial. IPOL, which was licensed based on a clinical trial with 3 days of safety review, and no control group. It was licensed in 1990. This is not the same product that preceded it from 1955. The Salk vaccine, which was removed from the market in the 1960s. This one was made with Vero cells. It had 2, 4, or 8 times the amount of antigen, depending on whether you're talking type 1, 2, or 3. Had a different formulation, different manufacturing process, completely different product. At least OPV could have been used as a control, presumably, but that had no control. And then there's various influenza vaccines. I will not go through those because there are many of them, but they will be detailed in the memorandum that I'm submitting that will accompany this, that will include the citations for everything on some of these slides. Most of the citations are at the bottom, but for some of them, they were too voluminous. They needed to be put in a separate memorandum. And then on this slide, we're going to go through all of the vaccines given 7 months and recommended for routine injection 7 months and older. Again, these are all the routine injected standalone vaccines for 7 months and older on the CDC schedule currently. And as we go down the list, starting at the top, we've got MMR2, which was licensed in 1978 in a clinical trial that had less than 1,000 children, reviewed safety for 42 days. It was only 1 dose. And there was no control group. They could have presumably used the MMR1 was licensed in 1971, but they did not. They could have maybe used standalones. They did not. There was no control group. And it's a very different product, and it very much needed its own. It should have been done if they thought that MMR1 had a proper safety baseline. Unlike the prior versions, for example, each vial of MMR2 contains, because the rubella component was now was grown on the cultured cell line of aborted fetus, includes billions of pieces of DNA from that cultured cell line, human DNA in each vial, which was not true of the prior vaccine. There are other major differences between the MMR2. Should have been properly trialed. There was no control in that trial, and it was underpowered anyway, and reviewed safe 42 days. Those trial reports I think are fascinating. Folks should look at them. About a third of the kids had gastrointestinal issues. A third of the children had respiratory issues. And there were other complications, but since there was no baseline of safety to compare it against, unclear how the FDA determined it was safe. Then Priorix, which is more recently licensed MMR vaccine, you then used MMR2 in its as the control. And actually, when you look at that clinical trial, and you look at the amount of adverse events, serious adverse events, as well as new onset medical conditions, in the 6 months that they finally did review safety in that trial, they were similar, but they were, I would argue, concerning. But because they were similar and MMR2 was presumed to be safe, it was not viewed as a concern. That brings us to Verivax, the very first and ever chickenpox vaccine licensed in the United States. No reason to not use an inert control group, but instead there were only a few hundred children who did not get an inert injection. They got an injection of 45 milligrams of neomycin, which is an antibiotic, which is per milliliter, which is obviously not inert. Topically, it can cause complications. Then you have 2 hepatitis A vaccine, Havrix and Vacta. They were both licensed right around the same time. No existing hepatitis A vaccine. No reason to not use an appropriate inert control to license those. But yet Havrix, for reasons that I cannot explain, had Engerix B as the only control that can be identified in one of its small trials. And Vacta was licensed based on a control group that received an injection of AAHS. That is Merck's proprietary aluminum adjuvant that scientists still are unable, independent scientists cannot get hold of to actually test as an antimarisol in the vial of each control. Why you would inject anybody with 2 substances that have no known therapeutic value when injected on their own is, I don't understand, and I don't even know how it's ethical, but yet that is what the control group received, again, not providing a proper baseline for safety. Then we have the 2 Tdap vaccines that were licensed in the U.S., Boostrix and Adacel. They used Decavax as a control. Decavac is only licensed for adults. Decavac was licensed in a trial with no control group. And then we have Gardasil 9, which was licensed in a control, based on a clinical trial in which Gardasil 4 was used as the control, for almost everybody, except for about 306 subjects who did get a placebo, finally, an actual placebo, so you can use one, but only after they got 3 doses of Gardasil 4. And Gardasil 4 was licensed based on a trial in which almost everybody in the control arm was injected with AHS, the aluminum adjuvant, as well as carrier solution. Again, not sure how that's ethical, but that's a separate issue. And then a few hundred got just an injection of the carrier solution, which is labeled as a saline placebo in the package insert, interestingly, but in the underlying documents is clearly not. It included everything in the vial except for the antigens and the adjuvant, including the yeast protein and so forth. And finally, and I hope I'm not putting anybody to sleep, brings us to the meningococcal ACWI, and there's currently 2 on the schedule, Menveo and Quadfi, excuse me. And when you go down the chain of those, Menveo was licensed based on a trial in which Menactra was the control, Menactra and Menomune was licensed without a control group. Same for the other one. Interestingly, today, if you pull up the package insert, and as required by federal regulations, Section 6.1 is supposed to reflect the clinical trial relied upon vis-a-vis safety for that product. And interestingly, the Menomune and the Menactra package insert, those are the 2 oldest ones, both have the same clinical trial listed in Section 6.1. The clinical trial relied upon to license Menactra, in which Menomune was the control. So apparently Menomune, Section 6.1 refers to a trial in which it was a control in its own package insert. Obviously, it didn't have that initially because that trial didn't exist. Okay, that takes us through every single standalone routine injected childhood vaccine on the schedule. And as you can see, the concern is that not one of them was licensed based on a placebo-controlled clinical trial, nor was any vaccine used as a control to license any of those vaccines, licensed based on a placebo-controlled trial, nowhere down the chain. I know there's a lot of folks in the press who are here, and they might go ask what they would call experts about this question. What I would suggest to them very strongly, instead of asking people, to look at the primary FDA sources yourself. If you want to know what was relied upon to license a vaccine by the FDA, ask or look at the FDA documentation. And the memo that I'm going to be, I've done this many times already, it's all available. It's on the FDA website, actually. So you can just go to the FDA website, or you can look at the supplement filing that I will be providing. And I suggest you look at that, in which I will detail and list every single citation, which already might be on this ACIP website or it's in the works. Okay. And we shouldn't even have to do this because the Secretary of HHS has made this point clear many times, and it is in fact a fact. And it's not just it really is an important point. It's a critical point because without a proper baseline of safety, you're laying assumption upon assumption that the product is safe as you see serious adverse event rates in those trials, because you're just looking to see is as safe as the existing product. And we'll look at 1 or 2 examples of that. Now, even if it was properly controlled, it has to review safety for long enough to actually see if there are any issues. Again, as we talked about, especially for infants, not going to know if there are issues in various domains of bodily functions until the child's at least a few years old. But yet, unfortunately, safety for routine injected childhood vaccines, they're often 6 months or less, sometimes days or weeks. On the chart in front of you, excuse me. So sorry. Okay. There we go. And I think I showed this one already. And on the chart in front of you, this reflects every infant vaccine on the schedule. that's currently routinely recommended, and you can see the solicited and the unsolicited periods of time that safety was reviewed in their clinical trials. All of them are far too short. And then even if you have enough, even if you're properly controlled and you review safety long enough, you still need to have enough children in the trial, and often the trials relied upon to license childhood vaccines are unfortunately very underpowered. And we'll just go through an example or two of that. Let's first at the the hepatitis B vaccine. As we noted earlier, there are only 2 routine ones licensed in the United States, Recombavax HB and Engerix B. For Recombavax HB, the first one licensed in 1986. Here is the summary of the clinical trials required by federal regulations in the package insert. I'll just read it. It says, in 3 clinical studies, 434 doses of Recombavax HB 5 micrograms were administered to 147 healthy infants and children up to 10 years of age, were monitored for 5 days after each dose. 147 healthy infants and children is not sufficiently powered to detect anything other than the most incredibly common reaction. And of course, there's a big age spread. It's not even like it was only infants. It was infants and children. And it only monitors safety for 5 days after injection in any event. Engerix B was licensed based on 4 days of safety review. And, unlike many of the other vaccines that we looked at earlier, where there was often only days or weeks, maybe 2 months, between licensure and the ACIP's recommendation, when it came to hepatitis B vaccine and the routine recommendation, there was a 5-year gap, as we saw, between the licensure of Recombavax HB and the routine recommendation for that product by this committee, and there was a 2-year gap for Engerix B. So we actually had an opportunity. There was time for more data to be aggregated between the licensure and the routine recommendation by this committee vis-a-vis safety. And I have on the screen here is the top part of the actual ACIP report in which it made its routine recommendation, and it lists in there everything it relied upon to make that recommendation. When you look through that document, what you'll find that there are only 3 articles that it cites that involve children receiving Recombavax, Engerix, or any other recombinant DNA technology vaccine, right? Because Recombavax HB was the very first recombinant DNA technology vaccine ever. Was a completely new platform for making a vaccine. It was revolutionary for its time. And the 3 articles that were cited, you could see they're all listed there below with the PMID numbers. They monitored safety for 7 days or less. They were underpowered. They were industry funded. Critically, this would not be sufficient to affirm the safety of these products before the routine recommendation. And I don't want to jump ahead too much, but if you can go back to the slides on the screen. There we go. Thank you. And I'm going to talk about post-licensure safety in a bit, but I would be remiss if I didn't just quickly hit on the fact that, I watched the last ACIP hearing, and in it there was a slide put up that said that the Institute of Medicine has concluded that the hepatitis B vaccine is safe. But in the most recent Institute of Medicine review of the hepatitis B vaccine, it looked at, which was commissioned by the CDC and HRSA, the Health Resources Service Administration. HRSA, which basically is defending against vaccine injury claims, presumably wanted the IOM to conduct this review and help it make causality conclusions. And it submitted to the Institute of Medicine what it claimed were the most commonly claimed injuries from various vaccines, including hepatitis B. And the IOM, effectively reached 3 categories of conclusions. One is that the evidence supported causation, the evidence rejects causation, or the evidence was inadequate to accept or reject causation. And while there were some that it rejected causation in that report, when it reviewed the conditions, and these are serious conditions, commonly reported serious conditions from the hepatitis B vaccine. When it reviewed the existing science studies with regards to whether or not, what does that data show on whether this vaccine causes it, parents are complaining about it, people are bringing claims about it, that should be a sufficient basis to study it. It found that for every single one of them, except for one, the studies hadn't been done to reach any kind of causality conclusion. Includes conditions like encephalitis, brain swelling, encephalopathy, brain damage, seizures, acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, transverse myelitis, optic neuritis. The list goes on. They're very concerning conditions. Okay. Give another example. The pneumococcal vaccine. So the very first licensed vaccine for pneumococcal, given at 2, 4, 6 months of age, was the Prevnar vaccine, Prevnar 7, and it was licensed on February 17th, 2000. ACIP recommended it for routine use, voted to recommend it on February 16th, actually a day prior to its licensure by the FDA. So clearly the data it primarily had available would have been the clinical trial data. And what was that clinical trial data? It was a clinical trial in which the control received a, quote, investigational meningococcal group C conjugate vaccine. The control...
Effective. However, they're going to argue that, well, it was unethical to use that comparison in the first place because it wasn't a proven intervention.
I'm not sure. It was unethical to use that because of proven intervention. Yes, that's exactly right. Whoever said that, the ghost in the wall. Yes, the argument will be, and I always hear this, well, it's unethical to test a later pneumococcal vaccine because we already have a licensed one. Sure, you do. And the very first licensed one ever was Prevnar 7, and the trial, though, was not against a placebo. It was not against something that was hurt. It was against another investigational vaccine. Okay, so that does not prove safety. And the safety review period was 30 days for emergency room, 60 for hospitalizations, and a little longer for select conditions. As a group of FDA and CDC scientists, interestingly, in a JAMA article, themselves said, quote, and that's on the right side of the screen, prior to licensure, the control group in the main study of Prevnar 7 received another experimental vaccine rather than a placebo. If both vaccines provoked similar adverse effects, little or no difference between the two groups might have been evident, end quote. They also noted that it had limited sample size. So, you know, here's the FDA and CDC scientists themselves reflecting on this, you know, the fact that we really can't rely on this trial for safety, but yet it is then used, PCV7 was used as the control to license PCV13. And in PCV13, it was licensed on February 24th, 2010, and ACIP recommended it for routine use on that very same day. So again, clinical trial data, critically important for making that recommendation. And in that trial, what it found was that serious adverse events reported following vaccination in infants and toddlers, again, this is given at 2, 4, and 6 months of age, in 8.2% among Prevnar 13 recipients and 7.2% among Prevnar recipients. So these are typically healthy infants and toddlers who, within a 6-month period, those are the percentages that developed a serious adverse event. And a serious adverse event, as defined by the FDA, means on the right side of the screen, death, life-threatening, hospitalization, disability or permanent damage, congenital anomaly, birth defect, required intervention to prevent permanent impairment, or require medical or surgical intervention to prevent an outcome above. The result in this trial, and I'll interject my personal view of it, should have caused concern given what Prevnar 7 was licensed again, but because the serious adverse event rates were similar, and you can look at the underlying FDA documentation, that was one of the reasons for not having concern. Well, then Prevnar 13 was used to license Prevnar 15, and in Prevnar 15's clinical trial, and there was 5 days between the licensure of Prevnar 15 and ACIP's recommendation of routine use. So again, clinical trial, critically important, one of the primary data available to this committee to look at. And what it found was that serious adverse events up to 6 months following vaccination with the 4-dose series were reported by 9.6% of Vaxneuvance, I'll just call it PCV15, recipients, and by 8.9% of Prevnar 13 recipients. But if you look down at the yellow highlighting below, it was found that there was no notable patterns or numerical imbalances between vaccination groups, and hence not apparently a concern. So just to recap, you have an investigational vaccine used as the control to license Prevnar 7, 7 to license 13, 13 to license the two currently used Prevnar vaccine 15, PCV 15 and PCV 20. In almost every instance, the primary data that would have been available about those specific products to this committee would have been the clinical trial data, and we've just reviewed that. It highlights, I say that not to pick on a particular vaccine. I'm not trying to get into the safety per se, though I think that the data we just looked at raises some very serious safety concerns that should have been, and should still be, by the way, looked very carefully at. But to just point out how important these clinical trials are to the decision-making of this committee and how it should really be demanding robust clinical trials. Let me continue. One more final example, and that is the DTaP vaccine. So there are two current standalone DTaP vaccine, Infinrix and Daptocel. Both were licensed based on a trial in which DTP was used as a control. They were both routinely recommended by this committee within about 2 to 3 months of their licensure, hence again the clinical trial being really important. And in 2014, SAGE, which is the committee that related to immunizations that advises WHO, conducted a systematic review actually with regards to DTP and mortality. And what they found is that, quote, the majority of studies indicated a deleterious effect of DTP on mortality. However, what SAGE concluded was that those studies are not going to be relied upon to conclude that DTP actually does increase mortality, because they raised 3 concerns. They said that those studies, despite the fact that a majority of them did show that DTP increased overall mortality, while it may have reduced deaths from diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, the kids getting the vaccine died overall at a higher rate than the children who didn't. It said that those studies were conducted, number one, in an environment with children also got OPV vaccine. Number 2, long after the vaccine was introduced. And 3, and hence, what they would call a post-elimination environment, though, put that terminology aside. And 3, that they weren't randomized. And so another trial was was conducted, if we can go to the next slide, please, in 2017, actually to specifically address those limitations brought up by SAGE. This was a trial conducted by Dr. Peter Abe and a group of scientists who I understand are highly regarded in the world of vaccinology. And what they did is they said, okay, let's see if we can construct a study that avoids those limitations. So in Guinea-Bissau, in the Badao Clinic, they went back and they looked at when they first introduced DTP vaccine. And these are this is the group that actually was bringing vaccines to Guinea-Bissau, to other, and so they certainly were trying to promote vaccines, not the other way around. And they went back and they looked at their data, and what they found is that, before I get to what they found, is that they went to when it was first introduced. So that first avoided the post-elimination environment issue. Second, they only compared children that got TTP and no other vaccines with children that got no DTP. And third, the vaccination was given based on birthdays, which is considered an acceptable form of randomization. So they specifically conducted a study that would directly address the 3 limitations that the SAGE brought up. And what they found was that, quote, vaccination with DTP vaccine the first 3 to 5 months of age was associated with a 10-fold higher mortality rate compared to unvaccinated infants. So that means that the vaccinated children died at 10 times the rate as the unvaccinated children, and vaccinated in this instance means just DTP, to be clear. Unvaccinated means no vaccines. The article concludes, all currently available evidence suggests that DTP vaccine may kill more children from other causes than it saves from diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. I bring this up. Obviously, DTP is not really relevant to the U.S. It's not relevant to the U.S. It's been phased out in the 1990s. But to point out that this is the vaccine used as the control, as the baseline of safety to license DTaP vaccine, which, by the way, would have been appropriate if DTP vaccine had been properly licensed. And maybe had it been properly licensed with a randomized, blinded, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial of sufficient duration and power, it would have found this very issue before it was even licensed. Next slide, please. I'm going to give an example of a non-routine vaccine. That's the dengue vaccine. And in this trial for this vaccine, it actually reviewed safety for 6 years for severe dengue and hence mortality. It had a placebo control and had a size of over 30,000 children. And by doing a trial that's far more appropriate, obviously, compared to what we've seen thus far, what it found was that children that were under 6 years of age had increased risk of severe harm and death from the vaccine. Hence, it's not recommended for children under 6 years of age. Period. It's not indicated for that use because it increases mortality. They discovered that because they did an appropriate trial. And for children 6 years of age and older that have never had dengue, again, they found that it increased the risk of severe harm and death from the vaccine. This is, by the way, in the package insert. You can just pull it up and look at it. So again, it is not indicated for any child that has never had dengue, because if they get this vaccine, again, the data reflect it will increase their chances of death and severe harm. But this was only uncovered because it had appropriate trial. I'm going to need to go quicker, I realize. Moving on to the next slide. Again, drug trials versus vaccine trials, you can see a big difference. And the question I get often asked is why, or that's raised, is why is there a difference between how dengue vaccine and non-routine vaccine or drugs are trialed versus versus how routine vaccines are trialed? And, you know, what I will, I think that the answer really comes down to the law that you have right on your screen, and that is the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. Economic interests drive corporate conduct. Companies, including pharmaceutical companies, are driven by economic self-interest. They want to make a profit, obviously. That's what their investors expect. That's what everybody with a retirement account expects. That's what Wall Street expects. That's what the board expects, and so forth. And so with drugs and non-routine vaccines, they are liable, remain liable for the injuries that are caused by those products after they come to market, and hence they have an economic self-interest in doing robust clinical trials beforehand. But when it comes to routine childhood vaccines, because of this law passed in the 1986 Act, they don't have those same concerns. A child can never, a parent can never bring a claim against a pharma company on the basis that their child was killed or injured because the product could have been made safer by the company and wasn't. That was the immunity granted. And why did this immunity come about? That's because leading up to 1986, as we saw earlier, there were only 3 routine vaccines on the childhood schedule, DTP, OPV, and MMR, but they were causing so much harm that all the manufacturers stopped making them or went out of business. And when I say cause harm, they had a lot of liability relating to harm and and so there were about 6 companies that made measles vaccine down to 1, about 6 that made pertussis down to 1, 3 that made polio down to 1. Now, many industries face this crossroads where their car gas tanks are exploding, or there are other issues with their product. They cause cancer. They have other detrimental effects. And when an industry faces that crossroad, the For every other product that I'm aware of, the solution is make a better, safer product. But when it came to these vaccines, Congress went a different way. They passed the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which gave these companies unprecedented and broad immunity. And again, this is the only product I'm aware of in the United States that has this immunity. And what that did was it inverted the economic self-interest. And I think what it does is with drugs, again, and non-routine vaccines, there's an economic interest to want to do a robust trial because the company has an economic interest to know that it's safe before it goes to market. They don't want to end up financially upside down. But they don't have that same economic interest when it comes to childhood vaccines. They're being good corporate stewards to their shareholders and trying to increase profit. Why the FDA would allow the licensure of routine injected childhood vaccines based on the trial data we've seen, that's best to ask the FDA. Now, next slide, please. There are ethical considerations on relying upon improper trials. This is from the British Medical Journal, and I'll quote it. In some trials, placebos are omitted on ethical grounds. This is illogical because studies destined to produce unreliable results should themselves be considered unethical. And so, my recommendation, or I should say my continence, that before, recommendations are made by the ACIP committee, it should have robust clinical trial data, especially when there's a very short time gap between licensure and the recommendation, and also that and there should be an insistence that for the any continued recommendation should be based on robust safety data. Okay, let's get to post-licensure safety on the U.S. child vaccine schedule. I'm going to start going a little bit faster. When the 1986 Act was passed, there was a provision in there that Congress did ask that HHS look at whether certain conditions are related to certain vaccines. It did that presumably because those were commonly claimed injuries from those products. The HHS in turn commissioned the Institute of Medicine, now known as the National Academy of Medicine, to review various serious harms claimed from rubella vaccine and pertussis vaccine. And the IOM issued its report in 1991. What you'll find is that the IOM found that for 4 of those conditions, the evidence favored rejecting a causal relationship. For 6 of them, the evidence favored accepting or convincingly supported a causal relationship. Those included acute encephalopathy and a few other very concerning conditions. But, and maybe this is equally concerning, for 12 of those serious conditions, the IOM said, you haven't done the studies for us to reach a causality conclusion. The IOM was again commissioned to look at a whole bunch of other commonly claimed serious adverse events from vaccines, and that was for a whole slew of other vaccines: diphtheria, tetanus, measles, mumps, OPV, IPV, Hep B, and Hib. And what it found in that instance when it published its report was that it could find only studies to rule out 4 of them as being causally related to vaccination. But for 12 of them, it found that the evidence did support or convincingly supported a causal relationship, including a number of very concerning conditions. And equally concerning, maybe even more concerning, for 41 of these serious conditions back in 1994 that were being claimed to occur from vaccination, the IOM said, you haven't done the studies for us to reach a causality conclusion. We can't rule them out. We don't know. And so the IOM said, it cautioned, it said, quote, the lack of adequate data regarding many of the adverse events under study was of major concern to the committee. Presentations at public meetings indicate that many parents and physicians share this concern. And obviously, what the IOM was saying is, you got to do more studies. You have to get better data. You have to properly study this. Fast forward to 2012, almost 2 decades later, as we discussed earlier, the CDC and HRSA this time paid the IOM to do another review. This time of what HRSA said were the 158 most commonly claimed adverse events from vaccines. I'll interject my personal view, is that many of these are the ones that happen very soon after vaccination. there's often no differential diagnosis and are harder to ignore. But putting that aside, here's what the IOM found: that the evidence that they could locate favors rejecting a causal relationship for 5 of them. For 16 of them, the evidence favored accepting or convincingly supports a causal relationship. And again, here we are almost 2 decades later, and for 134 of them, the Institute of Medicine said, you haven't done the studies for us to reach a causality conclusion. I mean, we can reach a conclusion to rule them out as a cause or to say that they are a cause. We've done that for some, but you haven't done the studies for almost all of them. And these are, it's not like HHS, CDC, HRSA were not aware. They're the ones who said these are the most commonly claimed injuries. They're the ones who said it. They're the ones that went to the IOM. And here we are, and you could see it looks like the amount of vaccine safety science post-licensure has gone down because the percentage of issues that IOM could reach a causality conclusion in 2012 versus 1991-94 went down. Over 80-something% they could not reach conclusion because the studies had not been done. And these are serious conditions: encephalomyelitis, autoimmune hepatitis, CIDP, encephalitis, fibromyalgia, GBS, hearing loss, ITP, juvenile arthritis, optic neuritis, small fiber neuropathy, SIDS. Okay. And this just combines all 4 of them. And I think that if you're trying to get a handle on, because I've heard a lot of discussion yesterday and today for the portions that I was able to hear about how, well, there's no indication they're not safe. Well, you can't find what you're not studying. That's first of all. That's critical. And, at least for 34 of the conditions, there was causality conclusion. For hepatitis B in particular, has been studied. Most of the most commonly claimed conditions vis-a-vis what the HRSA said are the most commonly claimed. I would say that if you asked me to create a list from the interactions we have with the public, obviously that wouldn't be as, it would be of a different nature, but there would be certain other conditions I would add to that list. Okay, going back to Dr. Plotkin and Dr. Orenstein, here's what they have to say about post-licensure safety, and this is in a 2024 article, so just last year. They said it is critical to examine adverse events following immunization that have not been detected in clinical trials. I'll interject and say that will be pretty much everything. To ascertain whether they are causally or coincidentally related to vaccination. Although the ACIP acknowledges the need, there are currently no resources earmarked for post-authorization safety studies beyond annual appropriations, which must be approved by Congress each year. The budget for vaccine safety monitoring at the CDC, which is responsible for the majority of U.S. federal efforts, has remained stagnant at about $20 million a year, which they say is an inadequate level of funding. And to really highlight this point, I'm just going to go through the injury that's claimed to be most thoroughly studied vis-a-vis any other injury, the one that's also probably the most controversial. Not to discuss or to go in any way into how vaccines might cause it, but whether or not the scientific community has actually studied whether or not the vaccines don't cause it. Okay, and I start with 1986, and this is what was provided by Congress in the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. It says that the Secretary of Health and Human Services shall complete a review of all relevant medical and scientific information on the nature, circumstances, and extent of the relationship, if any, between vaccines containing pertussants, including whole extracts and antigens, so meaning acellular, and the following illnesses and conditions. And it lists 11 conditions, one of which are autism. So this was Congress saying, hey, this is apparently was enough, a commonly claimed enough injury all the way back in 1986, even when ASD wasn't as common, to make it on this list of 11 conditions that Congress said to HHS, you need to review to see whether they're causally related. The HHS commissioned the Institute of Medicine, as we discussed, and the Institute of Medicine in 1991 published their report and said, we can't find a single study, no study. There's no category of evidence was found bearing on a judgment about causation. All categories of evidence left blank in Table 1.1. Fast forward to sorry. There's the slide. Apologies about that. Okay. And then fast forward to 2021 and 2012, excuse me, and the Institute of Medicine, again, at the request of HRSA, as it remained one of the most commonly claimed injuries from vaccination, again looked at whether pertussis-containing vaccine, including tetanus and diphtheria, cause autism, and it again could not identify a single study conducted that would rule out or that would have it draw a conclusion that it may not be causally related. In fact, they only did identify one study, and that study did find that there was a association between DTaP vaccines and autism, but it was not given weight because the IOM said, quote, it was based on passive surveillance system and it lacked an unvaccinated comparison population, which I agree with. You need to have an unvaccinated comparison population if you want to do proper vaccine safety studies. So the causality conclusion was the evidence is inadequate to accept or reject a causal relationship between diphtheria toxoid, tetanus toxoid, or acellular pertussis-containing vaccines and autism. I also had an opportunity to pose Dr. Stanley Plotkin, again, whose name is on the gavel, with regards to why would the medical community tell the public that vaccines don't cause autism if they don't have the studies to show that DTaP doesn't cause autism? I don't hear audio. I don't hear the audio.
Oh, we're tracking. Yeah, no audio. Oh, we're not set up for audio.
You're not set up for audio. Okay, well, the link will be in my submission, and anybody can watch it if they want. Anyways, Dr. Plotkin, I'll just summarize. It says, he affirms that that is the conclusion of the Institute of Medicine. There are no studies. This is in 2019. He doesn't identify any other studies that would rule out DTaP vaccines as a cause of autism, but he says he'll still tell a parent that vaccines do not cause autism, even though he doesn't have the studies to support that claim. On behalf of a nonprofit we represent, ICANN, the Informed Consent Action Network, we actually submitted 6 FOIA requests to the CDC asking them for the studies relied upon to claim that vaccines do not cause autism for each of the vaccines given in the first 6 months of life, as well as individually and cumulatively. The CDC did not provide any studies. We sued them in federal court, and we ended up having a settlement in which they enlisted 20 studies to claim that those vaccines given in the first 6 months of life, DTaP, Hib, Hep B, IPV, and PCV, do not cause autism. And on that list of 20 studies, not a single one relates to those vaccines, to those vaccines on the current schedule. 18 involved the thimerosal and/or MMR vaccine. MMR is not given until 1 year of age. None of these vaccines contain thimerosal. One involved antigen, not vaccine exposure, which itself said it can't rule out that vaccines cause autism. And then the last thing it cited to was the 2012 IOM review, the one we just looked at, that showed that it could not find any studies that show that DTaP doesn't cause autism, and only one study that did find association. And so the CDC website, as everybody knows, and as the press has reported widely on, has been updated to reflect what shouldn't be a controversial reality, right? Which is there are no studies that show that the vaccines given in the first 6 months of life do not cause autism. And that's an important question. And it's important because 40 to 70% of parents, when surveyed, do point to vaccines still today as a cause of their child's autism, often pointing to vaccines. And they point to the vaccines given in the first 6 months of life, as well as MMR. Do you hear that noise? I do. What is that? As well as, and so in any event, so obviously it's critically important that it be properly studied, not just claimed. And as I think it's heartening to see that the HHS website now says CDC website, and I will say that what I'm about to read is probably more likely to build vaccine confidence than the most things I've read on the CDC website. It says, this statement, the statement that vaccines do not cause autism, has historically been disseminated by the CDC and other federal health agencies within HHS to prevent vaccine hesitancy, meaning it wasn't disseminated because it was a scientifically based claim. It was disseminated because it was done to prevent vaccine hesitancy. That's not the way decision should be made. I wholeheartedly agree with a lot of the comments made over the last day, or today and yesterday, that decisions should be made with data. And if you're going to say vaccines don't cause autism, have the data to say it. Now, while the IOM can't identify many studies to rule out commonly claimed vaccine injury claims, there are data that are not available to the IOM or to the public, and some of that data is in the hands of the manufacturer sponsors of these vaccine products. And you can get in a typical lawsuit about a drug injury, often the way you prove that the drug caused the injury is when you get those underlying data that the company has and their internal reports and so forth. Well, with vaccines, you can't bring those kind of lawsuits typically, but you can get a glimpse into that data. And the way you do it is this. Under federal law, the vaccine package inserts are supposed to include, quote, only those adverse events for which there's some basis to believe there's a causal relationship between the drug and the occurrence of the adverse events, end quote. The FDA's guidance to industry says the same thing. There has to be some basis for the company to believe that it's causally related, not that it's just correlated with the product. And so when you pull up the package insert for each vaccine in section 6.2, when it lists those injuries or adverse events, it only, if it's in complying with federal laws, only listing those that it has a basis to believe are causally related. And I will say that those are similar injuries that the IOM gets. It's the similar injuries that HRSA claims are common ones my firm gets calls about. And in any event, to properly study whether or not vaccines are causally related, you really need an unvaccinated group. This is not controversial sometimes, and it's controversial at other times. So in the CDC manual for the surveillance of vaccine preventable diseases, it explains that because there's a lack of an unvaccinated group for comparison in VAERS, reports of VAERS are useful for generating hypotheses, but studies with vaccinated and unvaccinated subjects are necessary to confirm any hypotheses. As we saw earlier, the IOM, for example, discarded DTaP and autism study because it lacked an unvaccinated group. And in fact, typically when a study has a result that shows an association between a vaccine and harm, you will often hear the argument made, and in literature, in the scientific literature, that, well, that there isn't a proper control in unvaccinated group. I would say on that basis that all of the clinical trials relied upon to license these vaccines have been improper and so forth. But the important thing is to use good data to make decisions, in particular at ACIP, given how important the decisions are that this committee makes, because they often result in mandates across this country. And in 2013 IOM Vaccine Safety Review, they were commissioned to look at the entire vaccine schedule and its safety, and they said that, quote, no study compared the differences in health outcomes between entirely unimmunized populations of children and fully immunized children. Experts who addressed the committee pointed not to a body of evidence that had been overlooked, but rather to the fact that the existing research has not been designed to test the entire immunization schedule. Also, studies designed to examine the long-term effects of the cumulative number of vaccines or other aspects of the immunization schedule have not been conducted. The IMN explained that there is no evidence that the schedule is not safe. But those studies can be done. There are an estimated 45,000 children in the United States right now are 2 years of age who are completely unvaccinated based on the CDC data, and about 650,000 between 2 and 17 years of age. Those are children are already not receiving vaccines. They are unvaccinated. Those cohort data exist in HMO databases. They exist in captive payer environments. And the children, the health outcomes of those children and children who do receive vaccines can be compared. Unfortunately, our existing surveillance systems do not engage in that. They could, depending on the system, but they don't. VSD, for example, has an estimated around 20,000 unvaccinated children in its database, but I have never seen the Vaccine Safety Data Link used to publish a study comparing health outcomes between children, those children, and the health outcomes of vaccinated children. In fact, the Institute of Medicine in 2013 specifically said the VSD could be used to do that comparison. The CDC then commissioned a white paper on how to do that comparison, published in 2015. But yet to date, no such study has been published. I'll also point out that the VSD used to be housed in the CDC, but was removed out of CDC to take it out of the reach of FOIA and the ability of others to get access to it after scientists conducted studies in the VSD that I think were the CDC didn't agree with. And that creates obviously selection bias, because to use the VSD, you've got to go through the CDC effectively to get approval, or one of their partner organizations. And also the data underlying those studies are not available to the scientific community or the public effectively, I should say. There's a process you can ask for them, but you're not going to get them. We've tried. And we also, I should stop there. VAERS, CDC has refused to automate the capture and submission of VAERS reports. AHRQ actually funded a study at the Harvard program that did create a system to automate VAERS report capture and submission. They ended up capturing about 35,000 adverse events at a population of about 300,000 individuals. They created the system to submit it automatically to CDC, but when they contacted CDC, CDC refused to engage with them to actually connect the system they created with VAERS, and hence VAERS to this day remains an unautomated system. If you want to submit a VAERS report, it is an extremely arduous process. It takes a lot of time, and I'm amazed any medical professional, frankly, ever submits one. Then there's VSafe. VSafe is an automated system. It was developed initially for COVID vaccine, has been expanded slightly to monkeypox, and it is automated, but it fails to list reactions of interest. I'm going to rest on my submission on that, given the limited time. And CISA is another surveillance system, but it's not designed to assess population safety. There are studies that compare vaccinated with unvaccinated populations. That means no vaccines. Most of these studies are smaller. Some of them are based on parental surveys, which obviously come with confounders and bias. And they are not, and like every retrospective study, they are subject to confounders and to criticism. I can certainly level and point out problems with every single one of the studies I just listed on the screen. And there's a whole slew of others. There are a bunch of other studies, published and unpublished, that compare vaccinated and unvaccinated children. What I can say about them as a whole is that they consistently show the same outcomes, which is that the vaccinated children have multiple times the rate of chronic health issues. And which chronic health issues? Often the very chronic health issues that we have seen rise precipitously since the early 1980s. If I can go to the next slide, please. In the early 1980s, less than 10% of children, according to certain data, had a chronic health issue. Today it's over 40%. And most of that rise is in issues such as asthma, allergies, ADHD, and so forth. And when you look at the underlying etiology, they're often based on some form of immune system dysregulation, even ones like ADHD that you don't often think of that way. And again, I lay all that out in the accompanying memorandum. By the way, these same harms that have increased precipitously are also often disclosed in package inserts in section 6.2 as well. I'll just go back one slide, and I will point out that one of the big problems with the data and the studies, I should say, relied upon, I've seen historically at this committee, is that they often, on safety, they compare vaccinated with unvaccinated children, and hence almost all are confounded by healthy user bias, where it is the healthier children that go on to get more vaccines, and it's those who are injured by vaccines earlier that stop. And using risk windows is what I've also seen often be conducted with VSD studies. They'll look at a window of time after vaccination, in a group that all got vaccines, and a window of time after vaccination. At least they should compare, the time period before vaccination and after vaccination. And I think that as a recommendation to look very critically at any study submitted to this committee when they don't have a unexposed group. I'll end with one last point about post-licensure safety, and that's relating to aluminum adjuvants. This was a study that was conducted that looked at a bunch of the vaccines given to infants in the United States, and it actually found that for 6 of the vaccines, it contained a statistically significant greater quantity of aluminum adjuvant in the vial and they tested different lots than is on the package insert. and that for 4 of the vaccines, there was actually significantly lower quantity of aluminum adjuvant. Aluminum adjuvants are not like ionic aluminum. The animal studies where they have injected aluminum adjuvants and put fluorescence on it, and then track where the aluminum adjuvant goes in the animals, it often deposits in organs, particularly as well as the brain. Obviously, that's not good. Aluminum adjuvants can cause immune activation. They can cause they're neurotoxic and they're cytotoxic. And so you don't want those in the brain, and obviously carefully studying aluminum adjuvants and looking at the existing body of literature is important. But at the least, your product label should match what's in the vial. We actually submitted a petition to the FDA about 4 years ago now, asking the FDA to confirm, and we did that on behalf of one of the scientists on the study as well as a nonprofit, to confirm that this study's findings are wrong, that the labels in fact are correct, or to pause until you figure that out. And we have, they have sought extensions but have still never provided any proof that the labeling is correct. So with regards to post-licensure safety, when robust clinical trial data is not possible to obtain, robust post-licensure safety data should support recommendations, condition recommendations on sponsors providing any requested follow-up safety data. I know that's often requested, and I'm not so sure that it's provided, and revisits recommendations regularly. Efficacy in preventing transmission on the U.S. childhood vaccine schedule. I often don't hear this discussed at the committee. I thought this would be a good thing to just quickly touch upon as well. Live attenuated vaccines, such as Varivax or varicella, they generally prevent transmission of the target pathogen in most recipients for an extended period post-vaccination. Obviously, if it's preventing transmission, it can have reduce the pathogen in the community. But not all vaccines do that. And for example, the polio vaccine that we've used exclusively in the U.S. since 2000, inactivated polio vaccine does not prevent intestinal infection and therefore does not prevent poliovirus transmission. That's also reflected on the CDC website, where it says inactivated poliovirus vaccine does not stop transmission of the virus. It does not produce mucosal immunity, and hence it doesn't stop the proliferation of the poliovirus in your intestines and its transmission. Pertussis vaccine, similarly, we moved to exclusively acellular pertussis vaccine in the United States in the 1990s. The acellular pertussis vaccine, the amount of circulating pathogens did not seem to decline. That was observed because the intra-epidemic intervals were not getting wider for pertussis, which would happen if there was less circulating pathogen. The FDA conducted a study where they had a group of naive baboons, meaning no vaccine, never had pertussis, and a group of acellular pertussis baboons as well as convalescent. There was also wholesale, but that's not relevant to the U.S. Then they exposed them all to pertussis. Those that had never had pertussis or vaccine, they were able to swab pertussis from their nasopharynx for about 30 days. Those that had been acellular pertussis vaccinated, they were able to swab pertussis vaccine from the nasopharynx, if we can go back to that slide, please, for almost 35 days, though I'm not sure that was deemed statistically significant. For the convalescents, meaning those that had pertussis before already, they weren't able to swab any pertussis. And so this reflected that, as the title from the FDA article states, acellular pertussis vaccines protect against disease but fail to prevent infection and transmission in a non-human primate model. And as a consensus paper, including some of the world's leading pertussis vaccine experts and organizations said, natural infection with pertussis evokes both mucosal and systemic immune responses, while APVs, acellular pertussis vaccines, induce only a systemic immune response. Mucosal immunity is essential to prevent colonization and transmission of Bordetella pertussis organism. Consequently, preventative measures such as APVs do not induce a valid mucosal response and can prevent disease, but cannot avoid infection and transmission. Acellular pertussis vaccines do not prevent colonization. Consequently, they do not reduce the circulation of Bordetella pertussis and do not exert any herd immunity effect. One of the authors of this is actually one of the editors of the Pocket Vaccine book, and as well as the author of the pertussis vaccine chapter, and again, as well as some of the organizations the World Health Organization, you can read on there. The point here is this. If it doesn't stop transmission, but it reduces symptoms, those who are vaccinated actually are going to be less likely to know to stay home in bed, are actually more likely to continue to circulate in the community and in schools, and probably are more likely to spread the pathogen. But I've never heard that type of concern be brought up or raised. In fact, it's it's part of why we actually petitioned the FDA to add to the label of each pertussis vaccine that it doesn't prevent transmission. But the FDA responded by telling us that FDA's licensure standards for vaccines do not require demonstration of the prevention of infection or transmission. The pertussis vaccines that the FDA has licensed are for prevention of pertussis disease, not infection with Bordetella pertussis. FDA also noted that it's not convinced that there's any widespread misconception about this. I would disagree with that conclusion, but that's fine. Critically for ACIP, I would say it should demand, I would say, data demonstrating prevention of transmission and what effect a pathogen does have on introducing a vaccine does have on transmission. As you can see from this study article, it notes that the inter-epidemic intervals have not changed in any way since mass vaccination, which you would expect to have if it was preventing transmission. In fact, some of them have found they've gotten a little narrower, which would reflect an increasing amount of circulating pathogen. ACIP provides that, unlike routine catch-up and risk-based recommendations, ACIP makes shared clinical decision-making recommendations when individuals may benefit from vaccinations, but broad vaccination of people in that group is unlikely to have population-level impacts. And so when you think about that standard, query whether it is appropriate to ever make a routine recommendation for a vaccine that doesn't prevent transmission. Okay. Efficacy on preventing mortality, U.S. childhood vaccine schedule. Vaccines are intended to prevent symptoms if the vaccine is infected with the target pathogen, thereby potentially preventing disease and mortality. Obviously, if it's going to prevent you from getting measles, it will prevent you from the harm of measles. But we should also obviously need to take into account the risks as well. On to the benefits, this is the most widely cited article I typically see about the benefits among children born during 1994 to 2023, so 30-year period. Routine childhood vaccines will have prevented approximately 508 million cases of illness, 32 million cases of hospitalizations, and 1.1 million cases of death. That 1.1 million cases of death is what I've routinely have seen over and over again, and given the time constraints, especially right now, I'm only going to go through the mortality, and I'm going to go through it a little quicker. Here's the issue with the mortality figure in the study. It's taken as lore, it's cited as science, it's cited as a fact, and it's repeated by the press sitting over here to the right over and over again. I've seen it in a million articles. But it ignores, as the study says, it ignores all confounders, explaining, quote, this is what the study says, factors other than immunization, meaning hygiene, clean water, sanitation, anything else in the world, improvements in healthcare, improvements in acute care, might have contributed to lower disease risks in certain decades, and reductions resulting from these contributions have not been incorporated into the model. And hence, it pretty much ignores every confounder. It does the opposite of what science and studies are supposed to do. And hence, it's not surprising that it has no confidence intervals, because there can be no confidence in what it's claiming. In fact, it could be that it caused 1 million kids to die, and that would be within its existing confidence intervals, which are unbounded. The data also is unreliable, as I'll go through in a minute, because it doesn't actually seem to have really looked at the CDC mortality data, and it did not go through a peer review to the extent that peer reviews, putting aside any issues with peer review. It went through the clearance process at the CDC, and the clearance process at the CDC is one in which it only publishes things that align with the CDC policy, and the CDC policy are that vaccines are safe and effective. Citations for that programmatic for the ACIP CDC policy on that is in the memo that I'm submitting along with this. So let's just take a quick look at diphtheria. Diphtheria accounts for 750,000 of this 1.1 million live saves. Okay, so this article is claiming diphtheria saved 25,000 lives a year in the United States over the last 30 years. Here's the problem with that claim. Between 1900 and 1926, diphtheria mortality declined by over 80%. There was no vaccine. Between 1926 and the 1940s, there was a vaccine that was introduced, but it was only used in certain areas. And in the areas it was used and the areas it wasn't used, the mortality declined at the same rate. Hence, the vaccine does not have an impact. That's in the literature, and it's also cited in the memorandum that should be on the ACIP website. And so that takes us to 1949, when the first DTP vaccine was introduced. And it's when routine vaccination really first began. And in 1948, there were 634 deaths from diphtheria. Keep in mind that by the early 1980s, as we saw earlier, just for 3 doses plus, you only had a 60-something% uptake. And so to claim 25,000 deaths a year averted, it just ignores the historical data. It also ignores the fact that diphtheria immunity wanes such that an adult needs to get a dose every 10 years. 40% of adults don't get it, yet we haven't had a case of respiratory diphtheria in 30 years. And so when you actually look at the mortality data in context as well as the coverage rate, and then you look at diseases that are similar, like scarlet fever, which is also a lyophilized bacteria, which went away without vaccination. They tried to make a vaccine for it, but they failed. The 25,000 deaths a year just, it defies data. It claims 30,000 deaths from hepatitis B vaccines are prevented a year in the last 30 years. That's 90,000 to 1.1 million lives saved. I'll just point out that in 1980, the year before the very first hepatitis B vaccine, there were 294 deaths in the United States. And then for measles mortality, it claims that that measles vaccine has saved 2,833 lives a year in the United States over the last 30 years. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, before the very first measles vaccine it was introduced in the United States, there were only around 400 deaths a year. And I'll point out that there were about 4.2 million births a year in those years, and right now we have 3.8 million births a year in the United States. So there's less children being born now than in the late 50s and early 60s. And at a time when measles was endemic, everybody got it. There were about 400 deaths a year. But yet, measles vaccine today is estimated by this report to save 2,833 lives. And I will also point out that measles mortality between 1900 and 1963 declined by well over 98% into a rising population. And that had nothing to do with vaccination. So you have to assume, number one, that it would go the other way, even in a declining birth rate between the 60s and today. It just defies the data. There are also studies on nonspecific effects related to mortality, live versus non-live. We saw earlier how DTP vaccine has been found to increase all-cause mortality beyond any lives it might save, whereas live vaccines such as MMR and chickenpox have been found to have the opposite effect when used in developing countries. They have been found to reduce mortality in studies, though they are considered controversial by some, including, I believe, some at the FDA. They have, but the studies have, just like DTP, have found that they reduce all-cause mortality beyond the potential prevention of mortality from measles. Putting aside whether the accuracy of those studies, their applicability to the developed countries like the United States, which is what we're talking about today, that is even more difficult to ascertain at best, I'll put it. And I think the data on that is far more, is not as reflective. But when it comes to adults and the impact that eliminating measles has had in adults, there is some very clear data. This is a 100-plus person prospective 21-year-plus study in Japan that reviewed 100,000 individuals in Japan. So it's prospective. It looked at them forward-looking rather than retrospective. And one of the measures that it looked at was deaths from cardiovascular disease amongst those that had measles and mumps versus those that had not had measles and mumps. And what it found was that after 20 years, those that had measles and mumps had a 20% less death, statistically significant, from than those that did not have measles and mumps. So for men, that was reported as 0.8 with a confidence interval of 0.71 to 0.89. For women, it was a 17% reduction, reported as 0.83 with a confidence interval of 0.75 to 0.92. And so cardiovascular disease kills 900,000 Americans a year. Obviously, they're older, and so in a life years basis, maybe less than a child dying for sure. But those type of data, I think, are also critical when ACIP makes their decisions about introducing a vaccine product. What is the total societal health impacts? And on this screen, I have the number of deaths in the year prior to the introduction of the first vaccine for each of the diseases listed. And for DTP, I use 1948, the year before the first vaccine. And you could see that it's often a few dozen or 100. Every life death's a tragedy for sure. But it's hard to get to 1.1 million with this kind of data. I would also just point out that the further in history you go, the larger the numbers are, reflecting that, putting a polio aside, for every other one of these, for almost every other pathogen, the mortality was declining precipitously without a introduction of a vaccination. And I'm going to wrap up, and I'm going to say that when it comes to informed consent, I think that's really critical. It is really critical. I've heard a lot of comments about informed consent here, and I'm heartened to have heard them, because I think it's the lack of respect for informed consent that often leads to the very vaccine hesitancy that I think some members have expressed concern about. The ACIP guidelines provide that, unlike routine catch-up and risk-based recommendation, shared clinical decision-making recommendations are individually based and informed by a decision process between the healthcare provider and the patient or parent guardian. I would submit to you that that is what should exist for all decision-making. It should be an individual-based and informed by decision-making process. So, based on this standard, I would say all recommendations should be shared clinical decision-making. I'll end by saying that if there are members of this committee and prior committees and any future committee that wants to increase vaccine confidence, I would say that there are three things that they should think about and look at. Number one, need to depoliticize vaccines. I hear that all the time. But the only way you depoliticize vaccines is you need to take them out of politics. And the way you do that is you have to end mandates. Mandates make vaccines political. When you take away somebody's right, you have made it no longer just a medical question. You've made it a legal one. You've made it a political one. When you argue vaccines should be mandated and somebody's rights should be taken away on the basis that a vaccine is safe and effective, you've now made the safety and efficacy no longer just a medical question. You've made it a legal question. You've made it a political question. That's probably in part why you find me here today as a lawyer speaking about this topic. When you mandate vaccines and you eliminate exemptions, you destroy confidence. Look at countries like Denmark, numerous other European countries, many other provinces in other developed countries. They don't have mandates, and they have very high uptake rates. There's far less controversy there about vaccines. There's no controversy in America about maternal screening. I didn't hear anybody talk about the concerns that people would be issues with maternal screening. Why? Because nobody's mandating it. They're recommending it. They're encouraging. They're persuading on the merits. And who do mandates impact? They impact not those who want to get the products. They impact those who most need to avoid it. And the reason I bring this up is because what ACIP does and then what the liaison members do filters down often into mandates. Directly by some of the liaison members and indirectly by what the work of this committee does when they make routine recommendations. And those folks who most need to avoid their products, what happens to them? Because oftentimes, and these are folks who contact our firm who are injured by a vaccine, those in the medical community, and I've heard some of them today and yesterday, they just pretend like they don't exist. This vaccine's safe. As if the father who talked about this child dying, how about the parents whose child died of a Hep B vaccine who was compensated not long ago in the VICP program, not on the basis of a table injury, not on the basis, as I heard earlier yesterday, of some kind of, a settlement, but on proving the vaccine killed their baby. It was a neonate, by the way, it was a newborn. It was just given the Hep B on the first day of life that died from that vaccine. But the medical community often, to avoid vaccine hesitancy, does not give. Those folks feel like they're as if they don't exist. Every one of them, then they get kicked out of school, kicked out of their jobs. Things are said about them that are not always very nice. And those are the folks who then go and tell their stories. And their stories then can result in what folks describe as vaccine hesitancy. But they're really people who are trying to be heard, and mandates are the precipitator for what often results in that. And so liaisons, what I would urge is that for the liaison members in particular, to adopt policies that provide that they should persuade on the merits of these products and not coerce folks to do it. I'll wrap up in a minute. And I think that that's critically important if they want to increase vaccine confidence. After all, they have billions of dollars of federal government money and state health agency money and of their own money to promote these products. So they should be able to persuade on the merits. Lastly, I would say we do need to care about everyone. We should absolutely, critically important to care about any child that will be injured or die from an infectious disease. Critically important. But we also need to similarly give the same care and attention to any child that could be injured or die from these products. And I really believe we can do both. But we can't do that if we're licensing products and then they're recommended based on clinical trial data like we looked at earlier, or a post-licensure vaccine safety literature. And as we saw earlier, when parents contact our firm about a vaccine injury, that's what we look at. We go to look at the clinical trials because we have to prove causation often, even in the VICP, if it's off table, which most claims are. And then we look at the post-licensure literature. We need that data, too, to do that work, and it's vacuous. Why do we need the 1986 Act if vaccines are so safe, too? Why does a product need immunity if it doesn't cause harm? And why does products that have been on the market for why do products that have been on the market for decades, like the hepatitis B vaccine, still need that immunity? Do we still not know they're safe enough to lift the immunity on those products? Look, drug products that have very limited markets, tiny markets, that are given to very few people that have really bad adverse event profiles can still be sold profitably. Why? Pharma companies typically need to do two things. Number one, they need to make the product as safe as technologically feasible. And by doing so, they avoid design defect claims, which is the primary way you hold a company accountable for harms from their product. The type of claim you can never bring for a childhood vaccine. The second way is they disclose the risks that product can cause, and hence they avoid failure to warn claims. Those are the two primary claims that would be levied against a pharmaceutical company. I do not understand, well, I shouldn't say that. It's not true. There's probably a reason that this immunity still needs to continue for these products. And pretending that that reason doesn't exist is not going to make the problem any better, and it's not going to safeguard the kids that are injured by these products. I will close with that and just say that I hope that this presentation has been helpful. I appreciate the opportunity to present, and I welcome coming back at any point if you want to bring some of the other medical professionals, and so we can have a more robust debate with them as well here.
Thank you, Mr. Siri. I am directed by the DCP that we need to address the question of why Mr. Siri was here and whether other voices or points of view were solicited to participate in our discussion this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Siri. Just for everyone's knowledge, we invited several people to give us a broad perspective on the U.S. vaccine schedule, how we got here, and where we are. We invited 3 experts. We invited Dr. Paul Offit, a former ACIP member, to come and present his perspectives. And we also invited Dr. Peter Hotez, a vaccine developer at the Texas Children's Hospital. Unfortunately, they declined. And we appreciate your comments. Thank you.
So with that, we have a hard stop at 2 o'clock because our FDA liaison representative, who's going to be presenting, Dr. Hogue, is required to complete her presentation and then participate in a crucial meeting on behalf of the FDA. So we do need to move through this. We begin with questions, and please be focused, to Mr. Siri concerning his presentation from the ACIP members. Do we have any? So, Dr. Levy.
So thanks. This was a lot of information, and many of the issues that emerged were, touch upon things that we discussed today, among other things. I wanted to ask a question. So you mentioned mandates, and that sometimes recommendations by ACIP, the CDC, and maybe other professional organizations are leveraged by different entities to impose mandates. I personally think I share the sentiment that they are ethically wrong, but they're also fundamentally wrong from the perspective of a good public health policy. And I think I agree that the evidence from different countries suggests that policies that are based on teaching, educating, giving people, empowering people to have choices based on good information are much more successful. My question is to you as a lawyer, if we as ACIP, which is only advisory board, but on a federal level, what decisions or what ACIP can do in terms of its decisions, and what maybe the CDC at the federal level can do to make mandates less possible or less feasible?
Well, I think that anybody, any state, any entity, public and private, below the federal level that is engaged in conduct that would violate an individual's civil individual rights, for example, the right to a religious exemption, should not be funded by the government. The federal government has a duty to abide by the United States Constitution, and the very first freedom under the very First Amendment is the freedom of religion. And so any entity, private or public, that's violating that right, obviously private entities don't have an obligation to, but if they are, the government should be participating in it by providing funding.
Your perception is that this is allowed by the current legislation, or it needs some more work and amendments to the current legislation?
I think it's a mix of statute, regulation, and policy. I think it would happen at all levels. For example, the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is I understand not here at the moment, so they can't respond, but has put out a statement calling for the elimination of all non-medical exemptions for children to attend school in the United States.
Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Griffin. Concedes her time. Dr. Meissner.
There we go. Thank you, Robert. I don't know quite how to respond to this presentation. Mr. Siri, you live in this country, so you're entitled to the same First Amendment rights that we all are. But what you have said is a terrible, terrible distortion of all the facts. And I would like to be able to go through them one by one, but obviously Robert will be on my case after a few seconds. So I cannot do that. So I've got to select what I want to say. First of all, I'm very sorry that Paul Offit isn't here because I certainly cannot speak as effectively to your comments as Paul Offit could. But I can say a few things. There's just so much to say. It's hard to know. First of all, you began with slides that showed the increase in the number of vaccines that have been administered. What was your point? I mean, that is a phenomenal accomplishment. That's why we have the lowest rates of infectious disease in the United States, because we have the highest uptake of vaccines. And if vaccine uptake goes down, we're going to see an increase of these diseases, such as with hepatitis B, which I think is going to happen. Now, you clearly confuse associations. That is, there is a temporal association and a causal association. Remember, there are tens of thousands of vaccines that are administered every day. And just because there's an adverse event that occurs around the time of vaccine administration, it doesn't mean there is any causal association. And you're jumping to the conclusion that yes, there is. And that is not fair. You invoked Stanley Plotkin and Walter Orenstein, whom I know well, and that is so disingenuous. They have done more to support the vaccines and the health of children in the United States than almost anybody else. And for you to include them as skeptics is a gross distortion of the facts. Now, let me just go to a couple of points. You talked about the polio vaccine, and you said the current killed, that is the Salk vaccine that we're using now, does not prevent transmission. Well, that is correct. But why are we using the Salk vaccine instead of the Sabin vaccine? It was because the Sabin vaccine was associated with about a dozen cases of vaccine-related paralytic poliomyelitis every year. And so the decision was made to switch to the killed vaccine. You said, oh, it doesn't block transmission. Well, it doesn't block transmission, at least not very effectively. But there's a reason, because it would have been much more harm if we continued using the live vaccine. Let's go to the acellular pertussis vaccine. You said the acellular pertussis vaccine does not block transmission. That's probably true. It doesn't block it as well as the whole cell vaccine. But the reason we stopped using the whole cell vaccine is because it was associated with an increased risk of side effects that we could avoid by using a cellular vaccine. So, of course, it's an issue of weighing. We're going to lose the prevention of transmission, but we're going to reduce any harm and make the vaccine safer. How about the diphtheria vaccine? Well, you know, there was a recent report about from Europe that described over 500 cases of diphtheria in immigrants who had not been vaccinated. And there were, I think, 2 or 3 deaths among that cohort. Well, it goes to the point that the pathogens that cause these diseases are still around us. And if we stop vaccinating, we are going to see increases in rates of disease. So the same thing about your discussion about Prevnar. Prevnar began at 7-valent. It's now a number of additional serotypes that are included in the vaccine. That is the most wonderful, remarkable vaccine. It has had an enormous impact on public health. In fact, the public health benefits have been far greater among people who were not vaccinated, that is, the adults, than it had on children who were vaccinated. Because initially it wasn't recommended for adults. Now it is recommended for adults. That's another conversation. But the implication is that the safety of this vaccine was not measured. That's outrageous. You compared it. You said that you can't do seroconversion studies as a means of evaluating vaccines. Of course you can do seroconversion studies, because if we did efficacy trials with new pneumococcal vaccines or new pertussis vaccines, it would be almost impossible because the disease has become so rare. So if there are trials that would reasonably be done, they would. You say, oh, the FDA has licensed a vaccine, and then the next day or a few days later or a few weeks later, the ACIP recommends that vaccine. Well, that's a good thing, right? We're preventing disease. All you're focusing on are these very rare, ill-defined side effects and completely ignoring the extraordinary benefit and promise that these vaccines apply to us. You're a very effective lawyer, no question. You're very smooth. You know how to present the facts that are favorable to you or to your client. That's your responsibility. That's what you're paid, I suspect very handsomely. I suspect that's what you're paid to do, to sue people. But for you to come here and make these absolutely outrageous statements about safety, I think it's a big disappointment to me, and I don't think you should have been invited. I will be completely honest. Over.
Thanks, Cody. That just to keep track of time, we now only have 8 minutes left. But Mr. Siri, a number of I hope you're able to keep track of that.
Yeah.
You have the floor.
Thank you. Appreciate that, and Cody, thank you for the comments. I'll just respond to them in turn. In terms of why I had a slide about the increasing number of vaccines is because I was asked to discuss the development of the U.S. schedule, which I figured showing how many vaccines increased was part of what I would present. In terms of your comment that is, something to be marveled at, I never addressed that, but I will point out that we, in terms of developed countries in the United States, have the worst health outcomes amongst all developed countries. And so that is something to, really think about when you're thinking about overall health in this country. In terms of your claiming that you may not have the time to address all my points, I welcome a debate with you if you'd like. I will sit with you for 2 hours here in this forum or any other forum if you'd like, and we can go point by point. If you'd like to do that, I open that. I welcome that. In terms of Dr. Paul Offit, I should say I have had a back and forth with him online in writing, and it's all available. It was on Twitter first, and then moved over to Substack. So on mine, then on his. So you can feel free to see Paul Offit and I debating actually specifically about vaccine clinical trials. And I think actually it's a very telling exchange with citations instead of just verbally. And I encourage everybody in the media in particular to go look at my exchange with Dr. Paul Offit and look at every single cited reference that he cites and what I cite. In terms of Dr. Plotkin and Dr. Orenstein, I was citing their article. I'm sorry you take offense to that, but that just is what it is. And obviously, if Dr. Plotkin and I have spent 9 hours together in a deposition, you can watch all of that if you'd like. In terms of IPV not preventing transmission, yes, I certainly understand the switch over from OPV to IPV. And it was good that that OPV caused paralysis was recognized, but I would say that there's a number of vaccines today that also cause paralysis via transverse myelitis, Guillain-Barré syndrome. I have clients whose children are in a wheelchair today from vaccines. I don't think that those folks are considered ill-defined or rare, and that's exactly the point I was trying to make earlier. Treating those folks like they don't exist, Dr. Meisner, is what is going to breed vaccine hesitancy. They're there, they exist, just like they happen for OPV. It just took a long time for folks to accept that. In terms of DTP vaccine, I would say that most of the circles in the medical community in America still don't admit that that vaccine was really problematic, though it's nice to hear you slightly admit that on right now. In terms of diphtheria, the point is that there are environmental factors that impact diphtheria, in particular its pathogenicity. And so those, for example, those immigrants you discussed who have diphtheria, when you look at the underlying science, when the studies around this, certain living conditions create an environment where diphtheria can be more harmful and cause disease, where it doesn't seem to be the case when those environmental factors are absent. I never said, by the way, stop vaccinating. I don't know why you're saying I said that or reflecting that I did. I think this is America. I agree with you. Everybody should be free to get as many vaccines as they want. I support everybody's right to get as many vaccines as they want. That's freedom. And the same token, everybody should be free without any coercion or penalty to refuse a vaccine. In terms of saying that it's ridiculous to claim that PCV was not properly trialed before licensure, respectfully, sir, I think it's ridiculous to claim it the other way. Just using your term, I normally wouldn't use that word. I think the data speak for itself. Licensing a vaccine by using another experimental vaccine as a control, I think fairly falls into the word, again, your word, ridiculous. I would just say it's not proper. I would just say that that's not an appropriate control, and it does not establish a baseline of safety. And had the subsequent iterations of after that had not had serious adverse events, we're talking about babies, 2, 4, 6 months, at 8, 9%, okay, but it did. And that should be highly concerning when you don't have a baseline of safety in your initial trial. I don't understand why that should be controversial. I really can't. I also never said you can't use correlates of protection. I don't know why you're saying that, sir. Obviously, if you have a properly licensed, effective vaccine for a disease that has been properly licensed, that is the standard of care, and that should be used as the control, and obviously in a post-elimination environment. If that vaccine prevented transmission, obviously you'll have to use correlates of protection. I have no issue with that. I've read Chapter 2 of Plotkin's vaccine book and correlates of protection. I reflect back to you, Dr. Malone, your comments about correlate of protection and the complexities on them. I've actually had to litigate correlates of protection. In any event, I'll just, in terms of being paid handsomely, I will assure you that this is not a very lucrative endeavor. But putting that aside, I think the most egregious thing, if I may, is to call and reflect on folks who've been injured by these products as somehow rare and ill-defined. There are clear, serious risks. You just stop listening to parents. HRSA didn't give that long list of harms to the Institute of Medicine out of nowhere. Didn't come out of Grok or ChatGPT. It's real. These are real lives. These are real people. Now, I understand, I totally understand that an infectious disease doctor every day is confronted by folks who are harmed by infectious disease. So I understand that they are more oriented towards that. And obviously for me, I every day have encountered folks who are injured by these products. And so obviously I'm more oriented to that. I accept that bias, by the way. I accept it. But I am willing to say that that children can die of infectious disease. But the families who are impacted the other way, they're just not treated right. And until they are recognized, treated well, accepted by the medical community, don't have nasty notes put in their file if they say it's from vaccine. I've seen that often and over and over. That's just going to continue to grow vaccine hesitancy in this precious program that you're worried about. you're going to be its own undoing.
Well, can I respond, Robert, or no?
The problem is, we're now at the witching hour.